A weak and injured bobcat, its ribs visible under its matted fur, was found lying near a forest trail. Barely clinging to life, it seemed doomed. But what no one could see, not even the vet, was the secret it carried inside. What happened next would uncover a story of mystery, survival, and unexpected connections. A weak and injured bobcat, its ribs visible under its matted fur, was found lying near a forest trail. Barely clinging to life, it seemed doomed. But what no one could see, not even the vet, was the secret it carried inside. What happened next would uncover a story of mystery, survival, and unexpected connections. Dr. Helen Carter was no stranger to wildlife emergencies. As the only veterinarian in the region with a specialty in wild animals, she had seen her share of strange cases, but nothing prepared her for what was brought to her clinic that frosty morning. Park Ranger Ethan Blake carried the limp body of a bobcat into the small clinic. The animal's breathing was shallow, and its fur was clumped with dirt and blood. "I found it near the old logging trail," Ethan said, his voice heavy with concern. "It looks bad." Helen's heart sank as she examined the creature. The bobcat's thin frame told a story of hunger and struggle. Its left hind leg was twisted unnaturally, likely broken. But what stood out most was the massive swollen growth on its belly. It was a sight Helen had never encountered before. "This poor thing," she muttered, gently running her hands over the bobcat's ribs. Its pulse was weak, but it was still alive. "We need to act fast if we're going to save it." Ethan stayed by the table as Helen worked, his face etched with worry. "Do you think it's a tumor?" he asked, gesturing toward the bulge on the bobcat's belly. "It looks like it," Helen replied, "but it's unusually large. It could be something else, maybe an abscess or a severe infection. Either way, we need to open it up and find out." The bobcat stirred slightly, letting out a low, pained growl. Its golden eyes flickered open for a moment before closing again. Helen could feel the animal's life hanging by a thread. She prepped the operating room, calling her assistant Julie to help. Ethan insisted on staying, watching from the corner of the room as Helen anesthetized the bobcat and began the delicate process of stabilizing its injuries. "This is one tough animal," Helen said as she worked. "Surviving this long in its condition is nothing short of a miracle." As Helen examined the growth more closely, she noticed something unusual. The texture was hard and uneven, not what she expected from a typical tumor. Her brows knitted in confusion. "This doesn't feel right," she said aloud, drawing Ethan's attention. "What do you mean?" he asked, stepping closer. "It's not just a tumor," Helen replied, her voice tinged with curiosity and concern. "There's something inside it." Julie handed her a scalpel, and Helen made a careful incision into the swollen mass. As she worked, her breath caught. Something metallic glinted under the surgical light. "Is that metal?" Ethan asked, his voice rising with disbelief. Helen didn't answer immediately, too focused on extracting the object. Gently, she pulled out a small, rusted piece of metal, covered in layers of tissue and debris. As she cleaned it off, the shape became clear, a locket, tarnished but unmistakable. "What is this doing in a bobcat?" Julie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Helen held the locket up, turning it in her gloved hands. It was old, its edges worn smooth by time. She could make out faint engravings on its surface, but couldn't decipher them under the bright lights. "This isn't just a coincidence," Helen said, her voice steady but filled with unease. "Someone must have been connected to this bobcat. We need to figure out how." Oh. The room fell silent, the weight of the discovery pressing down on everyone. Ethan finally broke the quiet. "Do you think this could be from someone in the forest? Maybe someone who went missing?" Helen looked at him, her mind racing with possibilities. "I don't know," she admitted, "but this changes everything." As the bobcat lay recovering on the table, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. The locket, the strange circumstances, and the bobcat's resilience, it all felt connected. What secrets could this injured animal be carrying? And what had it survived to bring this relic to her hands? Helen placed the locket carefully on the counter and turned back to her patient. The bobcat's breathing had steadied, its body finally at rest. Whatever answers lay hidden in its past, Helen was determined to uncover them. For now, though, she focused on saving its life. The first step in a journey she couldn't yet imagine had already begun. Dr. Helen Carter stared at the locket resting on her counter, its tarnished surface catching the light. The tiny piece of metal didn't belong in a wild animal, let alone embedded in a growth that could have killed it. But there it was, a piece of someone's life tangled in the fate of a bobcat. She cleaned the object thoroughly, wiping away years of grime. As the details emerged, Helen saw faint engravings on the locket's surface, small flowers curling along the edges, and, in the center, a pair of initials, M and E. Her fingers hesitated as she opened the delicate clasp, revealing a faded photograph inside. A young couple, smiling brightly, posed in front of what looked like a dense forest. The edges of the image were curled and blurred, the years having taken their toll. Helen's thoughts raced. How could this have ended up inside the tumor? There were no signs the bobcat had ever been in contact with humans. It was thin, feral, and terrified when it arrived. Her experience with animals told her one thing. Whatever story lay behind this locket had to involve something more than coincidence. Ethan walked back into the room, carrying a tray of food he had picked up from a nearby cafe. He noticed Helen's intense focus and set the tray down without a word. "Did you figure out what it is?"
"It's a locket," Helen said, holding it up. "There's a photograph inside, and initials, M and E."
Ethan leaned closer, squinting at the locket. "That's odd. Do you think someone buried it in the woods and the bobcat dug it up?" Helen shook her head. "If it was buried, how did it get inside the tumor? That's not something that just happens." He frowned, glancing at the sleeping bobcat. Its fur had been cleaned, and its breathing had steadied, but the animal looked fragile. This poor guy has been through hell. Whatever happened, it's not normal. Helen turned the locket in her hand. The weight of it felt significant, as though it carried more than just a photograph and initials.
"I need to find out who this belonged to."
Ethan nodded slowly, a skeptical look crossing his face.
"How do you even start? The forest's history is full of stories, some good, some not so much."
Helen glanced at the bobcat. "It might sound ridiculous, but I think this animal is connected to those stories somehow." Ethan sighed, leaning against the counter. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "I can't just ignore it," Helen replied firmly. "If this belonged to someone, their story deserves to be told." Ethan stayed silent for a moment before giving a small shrug.
"All right, where do we start?"
Helen picked up her phone and snapped a picture of the locket and the photograph. "The library might have some old records or newspapers about this area. We can check for any missing persons connected to the initials." Ethan smirked faintly. "A library? Feels a little old school for solving mysteries." "Well, unless you know someone with a magic database of every person who's ever been in these woods, we're doing this my way," she said, her tone sharp but playful. He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fair enough." As they prepared to leave, Helen glanced back at the bobcat. Its chest rose and fell steadily, but its body remained still. She adjusted the blanket over it, brushing her fingers lightly against its fur. "I'll be back," she murmured. "Hang in there." The drive to the library was quiet. Snow had begun to fall, blanketing the town in a soft white layer. Ethan drove, occasionally glancing at Helen, who was deep in thought, scrolling through her phone and studying the photograph. "Do you ever feel like things happen for a reason?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "This locket," she said, holding it up. "The fact that it was inside that bobcat. It feels deliberate, like something is pointing us toward it." Ethan considered her words before replying. "I think sometimes things happen, and it's up to us to decide if they mean anything." She nodded, still staring at the photo. "I guess we'll find out." When they arrived at the library, the warmth of the building was a welcome reprieve from the cold. Helen wasted no time heading to the archives section, pulling out old newspapers and town records while Ethan stood nearby, scrolling through his phone.
"Got anything?"
he asked after nearly an hour of searching. Helen shook her head, frustration creeping into her voice.
"Not yet. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack."
Ethan suddenly straightened, his expression shifting. "Wait a second. Look at this." He handed her his phone, which displayed a grainy black and white photograph of a couple standing in a forest clearing. The image looked remarkably similar to the one in the locket. "Where did you find this?" Helen asked, her voice tinged with urgency.
"An old article from the 1950s, Ethan explained. "It's about a couple who went missing in these woods. Their names were Margaret and Edward."
Helen's breath caught as she stared at the screen. "M and E?"
Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "This might be the connection we're looking for."
Helen sat at her desk, the photograph from the locket laid carefully beside Ethan's phone. The grainy article he had found mentioned a couple, Margaret and Edward, who had disappeared in the 1950s while hiking in the forest. The details were sparse, but it was enough to ignite a sense of urgency. The article doesn't say much, Ethan said, scrolling through the text, just that they were last seen near a place called Hollow Ridge. Hollow Ridge? Helen repeated, her brow furrowing. That's not far from where the Bobcat was found.
Ethan nodded. Makes you wonder if there's more to this than a simple disappearance.
Helen picked up the locket again, her fingers tracing the engraved initials. If this belonged to Margaret or Edward, how did it end up inside that Bobcat? And why now, decades later? Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. That's the part that doesn't make sense. Even if the Bobcat somehow stumbled across it, how does something like this get embedded in a tumor? It's almost like it was swallowed. Helen's gaze shifted to the sleeping Bobcat in the recovery room. The animal seemed calmer now, its chest rising and falling steadily. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was tied to Margaret and Edward's story in a way that defied explanation. Whatever happened, I need to know, Helen said, standing abruptly. This can't just be a coincidence. Ethan raised an eyebrow. So, what's the next move? Back to the library? No, Helen replied. We need to talk to someone who knows the area, someone who might remember the story from back then. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. There's a guy who might help, Old Man Turner. He used to be a park ranger back in the day. He's a bit of a recluse now, but he knows more about this forest than anyone. Do you think he'd talk to us? Helen asked. Ethan shrugged. Worth a shot. I'll drive. The two of them headed out, the locket safely tucked into Helen's pocket. The drive to Turner's cabin took them deep into the forest, the snow-covered trees casting long shadows over the narrow road. When they arrived, the cabin looked as weathered and isolated as its owner's reputation suggested. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and a faint light glowed from one of the windows. Ethan knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with a weathered face and piercing eyes. His gaze shifted between Helen and Ethan, his expression guarded. What do you want? Turner asked, his voice gravelly. We need your help, Ethan said. It's about something we found in the woods. Turner narrowed his eyes. I've spent enough time with the forest. Don't need to hear more ghost stories. It's not a story, Helen interjected, pulling the locket from her pocket. She held it out, letting him see the photograph inside. Do you recognize this? Turner's eyes lingered on the locket, his expression hard to read. He exhaled deeply, stepping aside to let them in. All right, come in. The inside of the cabin was cluttered, but warm, with a crackling fire in the hearth, and shelves lined with books and trinkets from a lifetime spent in the wilderness. Turner motioned for them to sit at a small wooden table. That locket, he said, sitting down across from them, it belonged to Margaret. She and her husband, Edward, were good people, used to come to these woods every summer. What happened to them? Helen asked, leaning forward. Turner's gaze grew distant. They went missing one year, never came back. Everyone assumed they got lost or fell into one of the ravines, but the search party didn't find much, just an abandoned campsite near Hollow Ridge. Ethan frowned. Was there any sign of foul play? Turner hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. There were rumors. People talked about strange sounds in the woods, animals behaving oddly. Some even claimed the forest didn't want them to leave. Helen exchanged a glance with Ethan. What do you think happened? She asked. Turner sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't know, but if you've got that locket, maybe the forest is trying to tell you something. Helen leaned back, her thoughts swirling. Do you think something from the forest could have caused this? Something that connected the Bobcat to Margaret and Edward? Turner looked at her sharply. The forest doesn't forget, Dr. Carter. If that Bobcat's carrying a piece of their story, it's because the forest wants it found. The cryptic words lingered as they left Turner's cabin. The ride back was silent, the weight of his statement heavy in the air. Helen glanced at the locket in her hand, the initials glinting faintly in the moonlight. Margaret and Edward had vanished without a trace, but their story wasn't over. Helen was certain of that now. Whatever secrets the forest held, it wasn't done revealing them yet. Back at the clinic, Helen sat at her desk, turning the locket over in her hands. Turner's words echoed in her mind. The forest doesn't forget. It felt more like a warning than an observation. The Bobcat, now resting more peacefully in the recovery room, seemed like the key to unraveling the mystery. Ethan entered the office holding a steaming cup of coffee. Still thinking about what Turner said? He asked, setting the mug on the desk. Helen nodded. It's hard not to. He made it sound like the forest has a mind of its own. He spent decades out there, Ethan replied. It's probably shaped how he sees things. But I think he's on to something. The locket didn't end up in the Bobcat by accident. Helen glanced toward the recovery room. I just don't understand how it got there. It defies everything I know about biology and wildlife. Ethan leaned against the wall, folding his arms. Maybe the Bobcat found it and swallowed it? Could that explain how it ended up in the tumor? She considered this for a moment. It's possible, but it doesn't explain why it would be embedded like that. Tumors don't just form around foreign objects without a trigger. The Bobcat stirred, letting out a low growl that quickly subsided. Helen watched it closely. There was something unusual about this animal, beyond its injuries, beyond the locket. It was as though it carried an invisible weight, something unexplainable but deeply significant. Whatever the explanation, I don't think we're going to find it in a biology textbook, Ethan said, interrupting her thoughts. Maybe it's time to go back to where this started. You mean Hollow Ridge? Helen asked, raising an eyebrow. Ethan nodded. The locket, the couple, the Bobcat, it all points back there. If we're going to understand this, we need to see where it happened. Helen hesitated. The idea of venturing into the forest felt daunting, especially after what Turner had said. But deep down, she knew Ethan was right. The answers weren't in the clinic or the archives. They were out there, waiting to be found.
All right, she said finally. We'll go tomorrow, but we need to be prepared. The forest in winter isn't forgiving.
Ethan gave a faint smile. I'll handle the supplies. You just bring that locket. The next morning, they set out early, bundled against the biting cold. The forest was eerily quiet, the thick snow muffling their footsteps. The trail to Hollow Ridge was faint, barely visible under the frost-covered ground. As they walked, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Do you feel that? She asked, glancing around. Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the trees. The forest always feels different out here, like it's alive. Helen gripped the locket in her pocket, its cold metal reassuring against her fingers. They pressed on, the silence broken only by the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. After nearly an hour, they reached a clearing with a steep ridge rising in the distance. This must be it, Ethan said, stopping to take in the view. Helen looked around. The place felt untouched, as if time had forgotten it. The trees loomed tall and ancient, their bare branches forming a tangled web against the sky. A faint sense of unease crept over her. We should look for anything unusual, she said, stepping carefully into the clearing. Ethan nodded and began scanning the ground. Helen moved toward the base of the ridge, her eyes catching a glint of something in the snow. Kneeling, she brushed away the frost and uncovered a weathered tin box, its edges rusted but intact. Ethan, she called, holding up the box. He hurried over, his breath visible in the cold air. What is that? I don't know, Helen replied, opening it carefully. Inside was a collection of items, a worn leather notebook, a small compass, and a yellowed map. She opened the notebook, her heart racing as she saw Margaret's name scrawled across the first page. The entries were written in neat, looping handwriting, recounting the couple's journey through the forest. Helen flipped through the pages, but the final entry stopped her cold. The words were hurried, almost frantic. Edward heard it again last night. The sounds are getting closer. We're not alone here. Ethan read over her shoulder, his brow furrowing. What do you think they meant by that? I don't know, Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. But whatever it was, it scared them. She looked up at the ridge, its rocky face looming over them. The notebook was more than just a record of Margaret and Edward's trip. It was a warning. Something had happened here, something the forest had kept hidden for decades. As they packed up the box, a low growl echoed through the clearing. Helen and Ethan froze, their eyes scanning the trees. A pair of golden eyes glinted in the shadows, watching them intently. It's another bobcat, Ethan whispered, reaching for the small pack on his back. Helen raised a hand to stop him. The animal stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It was larger than the injured bobcat at the clinic, its fur thick and unkempt. But there was something familiar about its gaze, something that sent a chill down Helen's spine. The bobcat stood at the edge of the clearing, its eyes fixed on Helen. For a moment, it seemed almost expectant. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Helen let out a shaky breath, her hand still clutching the locket. What was that? Ethan shook his head. I don't know, but
I don't think it was just curious.
They stood in silence for a moment, the forest around them eerily still. Whatever had drawn them to Hollow Ridge wasn't finished revealing its secrets. Helen knew they were closer to the truth, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was leading them somewhere they weren't ready to go. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Helen and Ethan retraced their steps through the snowy trail. The tin box was safely tucked into Helen's pack, but the tension from their encounter with the second bobcat lingered in the air. Neither of them spoke for a while, their footsteps crunching softly against the frost. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Do you think that bobcat was following us?" Helen nodded slowly. "It felt like it was watching us, almost like it wanted us to see something." Ethan glanced back over his shoulder, his expression cautious. "That's two strange coincidences now. First, the locket inside the tumor, and now this." "It's not just coincidence," Helen said, gripping the straps of her pack tightly. "There's something tying all of this together. The locket, the notebook, the bobcats. This isn't random."
Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You're starting to sound like Turner."
Helen gave a faint smile, though her nerves were still on edge. Maybe he's right. Maybe the forest really doesn't forget. When they reached the trailhead, the familiar sight of Ethan's truck brought a wave of relief. They climbed inside, the warmth of the heater easing the cold that had seeped into their bones. As they drove back toward town, Helen pulled the notebook from her pack and opened it again. Margaret's entries painted a picture of an adventurous but cautious woman. She wrote about the beauty of the forest, their joy in discovering hidden trails, and her admiration for Edward's unyielding optimism. But as the entries progressed, a darker tone crept in. "Listen to this," Helen said, reading aloud. "Edward swears he saw something near the ridge today. He said it moved too fast to be human, but was too large to be any animal we've seen. I thought he was imagining things, but tonight, I heard it too." Ethan glanced at her. "What do you think they heard?" "I don't know," Helen admitted, flipping through the pages. "But it sounds like whatever it was, it scared them enough to make them want to leave." She stopped at another entry, the writing even more frantic. "We packed up camp, but it feels like we're being watched. Edward is trying to stay calm, but I can see it in his eyes. He's scared. We should have left yesterday." Ethan exhaled, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "That doesn't sound like a simple hiking trip gone wrong. They knew something was out there." Helen nodded, her thoughts racing. The forest had kept its secrets for decades, but Margaret's words suggested those secrets were far from benign. When they reached the clinic, the bobcat in the recovery room was awake, its golden eyes following Helen as she approached. It let out a low growl but didn't move, its body still too weak to do much more. Helen knelt beside the cage, her voice soft. "You're part of this, aren't you?" she murmured. "You've been through something no one can explain." Ethan watched from the doorway, his arms crossed. "Do you think it's connected to the other bobcat we saw?" "It has to be," Helen said, standing. "There's no way this is all just chance." Ethan nodded slowly. "So, what's next?" "We keep digging," Helen replied. "The notebook mentioned a campsite near the ridge. If we can find that, maybe we'll get more answers." The next morning, armed with maps and camping gear, they set out for the forest again. This time, they were prepared to spend the day, and possibly the night, searching for the couple's campsite. The forest felt even more imposing now, its towering trees casting long shadows despite the bright morning light. As they neared Hollow Ridge, Helen noticed a faint trail branching off from the main path. The snow-covered ground made it difficult to see, but there were subtle signs, disturbed patches of earth, broken twigs, and faint indentations that suggested an old footpath. "This could be it," she said, pointing it out to Ethan. He nodded. "Let's check it out." The trail led them deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and the air colder. After nearly an hour of walking, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was what remained of a fire pit, surrounded by a few rusted tin cans and fragments of cloth half buried in the snow. "This must be their campsite," Ethan said, crouching to examine the fire pit. Helen knelt beside a piece of fabric, pulling it free from the frozen ground. It was brittle with age, but the faint pattern of flowers matched the design on the locket. She held it up, her breath visible in the frigid air. "This belonged to Margaret." Ethan nodded, his gaze sweeping the clearing. If they were here, then something must have driven them to leave in a hurry. Helen's eyes fell on a large tree near the edge of the clearing. Deep scratches marred its bark, too high up to have been made by a small animal. She ran her fingers over the marks, their jagged edges rough against her skin. "These aren't from any animal I've seen," she said. "At least, not one that should be in this forest." Ethan joined her, his expression grim.
Whatever did that wasn't small.
The unease from the previous day returned, heavier now. The clearing felt wrong, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Helen and Ethan exchanged a glance, the same unspoken thought passing between them. They weren't alone. A rustling sound came from the trees behind them. They spun around, scanning the shadows. A low growl echoed through the clearing, deeper and more menacing than before. Helen gripped the locket in her pocket, her pulse racing. Whatever secrets the forest held, they were about to face them head-on. Ethan stepped closer to Helen, his eyes darting toward the source of the growl. The forest had grown unnervingly silent, save for the faint rustling in the shadows. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, as though the trees themselves were closing in around them. "Do you see anything?" Ethan whispered, his voice tense. Helen shook her head, her hand gripping the locket tightly in her pocket.
"No, but it's close."
The growl came again, this time accompanied by the faint crunch of snow. Helen's heart raced as she scanned the dense underbrush. Suddenly, a figure emerged, a large bobcat, its golden eyes glowing with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. This one was even larger than the first they had encountered, its fur thick and wild, with deep scars crisscrossing its body. "It's another one," Ethan murmured, taking a cautious step back. Helen held her ground, her gaze locked on the animal. Something about its movements felt deliberate, almost calculated. It didn't lunge or show signs of aggression. Instead, it watched them, its eyes flickering between Helen and the locket in her pocket. "It's not attacking," Helen whispered. "It's trying to tell us something." Ethan glanced at her. "You're saying this bobcat is guiding us?" Helen nodded slowly.
"I think so. Look at the way it's moving."
The bobcat turned abruptly, its powerful body cutting through the snow with ease. It paused at the edge of the clearing, glancing back at them, as though waiting. "You've got to be kidding me," Ethan said, his voice laced with disbelief. "It wants us to follow," Helen said, already stepping forward. "Or it's leading us into a trap," Ethan countered, his tone wary. Helen glanced over her shoulder. "If we don't follow, we'll never know. You don't have to come if you're not comfortable."
Ethan let out a frustrated sigh, but didn't hesitate to fall in step behind her. "If this goes south, I'm blaming you."
The bobcat moved gracefully through the forest, its path winding deeper into the trees. Helen and Ethan followed it at a cautious distance, the tension between them thick. The light filtering through the canopy grew dimmer, the shadows stretching longer as the afternoon wore on. After what felt like an eternity, the bobcat led them to another clearing. This one was different, unnervingly quiet and dominated by a massive rock formation. The jagged stones jutted out of the earth like the spines of some ancient beast, their surfaces covered in moss and snow. "The Sentinel," Ethan said under his breath, recognition dawning on his face. Helen turned to him. "You've heard of this place?" He nodded. "It's a local legend. People say strange things happen here. Disappearances, weird sounds, even sightings of creatures no one can explain." Helen looked at the formation, her pulse quickening. "This has to be where Margaret and Edward came." The bobcat padded toward the base of the rocks, pausing beside a narrow opening barely visible beneath the snow. It let out a low growl, its ears twitching as it glanced back at them. "It's pointing us to that opening," Helen said, stepping closer. Ethan grabbed her arm. "Hold on. We don't know what's in there." Helen hesitated, but the locket in her pocket felt heavier now, as though urging her forward. "We didn't come this far to turn back," she said softly. "Whatever happened to Margaret and Edward, the answer is in there." Reluctantly, Ethan released her arm and followed as she approached the narrow gap in the rocks. The air grew colder as they moved closer, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into their bones. Helen knelt beside the opening, brushing away the snow to reveal a faint carving on the stone. "It's a symbol," she said, tracing the worn lines with her fingers. It resembled an eye, surrounded by jagged lines that could have been lightning or branches. "Looks like something tribal," Ethan said, crouching beside her. "But why is it here?" Helen didn't respond. Instead, she took a deep breath and peered into the dark crevice. The light from her headlamp revealed a narrow passage leading downward, the walls rough and uneven. "It goes deeper," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. Ethan sighed. "Of course it does." The two of them squeezed through the opening, the bobcat remaining outside but watching intently. The passage was tight, the air damp and heavy. Helen's heart pounded in her chest as they descended, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone walls. The narrow tunnel opened into a cavern, its ceiling high and arched like the ribs of a great beast. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth, and the floor was littered with bones, animal remains, scattered and broken. "This is unsettling," Ethan said, his voice low. Helen's light swept across the cavern, landing on something that made her breath catch. Against the far wall, partially hidden by the shadows, was a pile of objects: a rusted kettle, a torn sleeping bag, and a pair of hiking boots. "This must be their camp," she said, stepping closer. Ethan followed, his eyes scanning the scene. If this is where they ended up, what happened to them? Helen knelt beside the sleeping bag, her fingers brushing against the fabric. It was old and brittle, but there was no mistaking it. It had been Margaret's. Beside it lay a journal, its cover cracked and worn. She picked it up carefully, flipping through the pages. The last entry sent a chill down her spine. "It's here. We can't escape. If someone finds this, please tell them we tried. Tell them we didn't want to leave each other." Ethan read over her shoulder, his face pale. "They knew they weren't getting out." Helen closed the journal, her hands trembling. Whatever happened to them, it started here, but it's not over. A growl echoed from the entrance of the cavern, louder and closer this time. Helen and Ethan turned sharply, their lights cutting through the darkness. The golden eyes of another bobcat glinted in the shadows, but this one wasn't alone. More pairs of eyes appeared, watching them intently from the darkness. The forest wasn't done with them yet. The growls grew louder, reverberating through the cavern walls. Helen's breath hitched as more bobcats emerged from the shadows, their golden eyes glowing like embers in the dark. These weren't ordinary animals. Their movements were deliberate, their gazes locked on Helen and Ethan, not with malice, but with a purpose that was impossible to ignore. Ethan stepped closer to Helen, his voice barely a whisper. "This is not normal. What do we do?" Helen kept her eyes on the nearest bobcat, trying to steady her breathing. "We don't provoke them. They're not attacking. Yet." The lead bobcat, larger than the rest, stepped forward, its paws silent against the stone floor. It stopped a few feet from Helen, its head tilting slightly as though studying her. Helen felt the locket in her pocket grow warm against her skin, the sensation so unexpected that she instinctively reached for it. As her hand emerged, the locket dangling from her fingers, the bobcat's eyes fixed on it. The animal let out a low, almost mournful growl, and the other bobcats seemed to shift uneasily, their growls softening. Helen's pulse quickened as she raised the locket, its tarnished surface catching the faint light. "They recognize it," she whispered. "They know what this is." Ethan glanced at her, his brow furrowed. How is that even possible? The lead bobcat stepped closer, its golden eyes now filled with something that looked almost like sorrow. Helen crouched slowly, holding the locket out in her palm. The bobcat sniffed the air, its massive head lowering until its nose nearly touched the locket. For a brief moment, the cavern was silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Then the bobcat let out a low rumble, a sound that seemed more like a call than a growl. The other bobcats began to move, circling Helen and Ethan, but keeping their distance. Their formation wasn't threatening, it was guiding. "They want us to follow," Helen said, rising cautiously. Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting between the bobcats and the cavern's exit. "Follow them where? Deeper into this cave?" Helen nodded. "They brought us here for a reason. If we don't follow, we might never understand." Ethan exhaled sharply, but nodded. "All right, but if this goes bad, I'm grabbing you and running." The lead bobcat turned and padded toward a dark tunnel on the far side of the cavern. Helen and Ethan followed, the other bobcats flanking them like silent sentinels. The tunnel twisted and narrowed, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The faint scent of decay hung in the air, sending a chill down Helen's spine. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but eerily lit by faint beams of light filtering through cracks in the ceiling. In the center of the chamber was a stone pedestal, its surface smooth and weathered. On the pedestal lay a second locket, identical to the one Helen held, but gleaming as though untouched by time. Ethan stared at the locket, his jaw tightening. "This has to be theirs! Margaret and Edward!" Helen approached the pedestal cautiously, the bobcats watching her every move. She set the first locket beside the second, and the moment the two touched, a strange warmth spread through the air. The faint light in the chamber seemed to intensify, illuminating carvings on the pedestal and the walls around it. The carvings told a story, figures of people and animals intertwined, their fates connected in ways that were both beautiful and tragic. At the center of the depiction was a circle of bobcats, their eyes glowing just as the ones in the chamber did now. Above them, human figures held what looked like lockets, their hands outstretched in offering. Helen ran her fingers over the carvings, her mind racing. "It's like a bond," she murmured. "These animals aren't just guardians of the forest. They're tied to it, to the people who come here." Ethan's voice was low. "Margaret and Edward must have stumbled into something that they didn't understand."
Helen nodded. "They became part of this connection. Maybe willingly, maybe not. But it explains why the bobcats are drawn to these lockets."
She turned to the lead bobcat, its golden eyes meeting hers. "You're their keepers, aren't you? Protecting their story, their legacy." The bobcat let out a soft rumble, its gaze unwavering. Helen's heart ached at the weight of it all, the love and loss, the lives intertwined across decades. Ethan stepped forward, his voice hesitant. "If the lockets are tied to Margaret and Edward, does that mean—" Helen finished his thought. "That they're still here, in some way?" The room grew quiet as the weight of her words sank in. The carvings, the lockets, the bobcats, they all pointed to a truth that was impossible to ignore. Margaret and Edward had become part of the forest, their story preserved in its depths. But the question remained, what had driven them to stay, and at what cost? Helen picked up both lockets, their combined warmth almost comforting. She turned to Ethan, her resolve firm. "We need to leave, but we're not done yet." The bobcats watched as Helen and Ethan retraced their steps through the cavern. The lead bobcat followed them to the entrance, pausing at the threshold as if to see them off. As Helen and Ethan stepped into the open air, the sun dipping below the horizon, Helen looked back one last time. The bobcat stood motionless, its eyes locked on hers. It let out a low, mournful sound before retreating into the shadows. As the forest swallowed the sound, Helen clutched the lockets tightly. Whatever had happened to Margaret and Edward wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mystery woven into the fabric of the forest itself. And Helen wasn't about to leave it unresolved. The drive back to the clinic was cloaked in silence, broken only by the hum of the tires on the snowy road. Helen clutched the lockets in her hands, her thoughts a tangle of questions. The carvings, the bobcats, the pedestal. It all pointed to something deeper, something ancient. Margaret and Edward's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was part of a story the forest had kept hidden for decades.
Ethan glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "You've been quiet since we left. What's going through your head?"
Helen turned the lockets over, studying their intricate designs. "Everything about this feels intentional. The bobcats, the carvings, the lockets. It's like they were meant to be found." Ethan nodded. "But found by who? Us? Or anyone who wandered into the forest?"
Helen sighed. "I don't know, but the forest has been protecting this secret for years. It wasn't ready to let it go, until now."
When they reached the clinic, Helen immediately went to the recovery room. The injured bobcat was awake, its eyes sharp and alert as it watched her enter. There was a calmness to it now, a sense of knowing that made Helen's chest tighten. She sat beside the cage, holding up the lockets. "We found them," she said softly. "Whatever you were trying to tell us, we're starting to understand." The bobcat tilted its head, letting out a low rumble. Helen felt an unspoken connection, as if the animal recognized what she held. It wasn't just a relic, it was a piece of a story, one that demanded to be told. Ethan joined her, leaning against the doorway. "What now? We've found the lockets, the carvings, and the campsite. Do we just let it end here?" Helen shook her head. "No, we need to piece this together, find out what really happened to Margaret and Edward." "How?" Ethan asked. "We've seen the carvings, but they're not exactly a clear explanation." Helen stood, her resolve firm. "We need to go through everything. The carvings, the journal, anything we can find about the forest's history. There's more to this than what we've seen." For the next several hours, they pored over the journal, the lockets, and photographs Helen had taken of the carvings. Margaret's entries painted a vivid picture of her love for Edward and their shared joy in exploring the forest. But the final pages grew darker, detailing their fear and the strange events that plagued their last days. Helen ran her finger over the journal's last entry. "It's here. We can't escape." She looked up at Ethan. "What if they didn't try to escape? What if they chose to stay?" Ethan frowned.
"Stay? Why would anyone stay knowing what was out there?
Helen gestured to the carvings in the photographs. Look at this. The people holding the lockets, the animals surrounding them. It's not just a story about danger. It's a story about connection. Maybe Margaret and Edward realized they weren't meant to leave. Ethan leaned back in his chair, processing her words. So, you're saying they became part of the forest, like the Bobcats?
Helen nodded. It sounds impossible, but what if it's true? The forest, the animals, the lockets, they're all part of something bigger.
The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. For Helen, the idea wasn't just a theory. It felt like the only explanation that made sense. Margaret and Edward hadn't disappeared. They had been absorbed into the forest story, their presence lingering in the animals, the carvings, and the lockets. Ethan broke the silence. If that's true, what does it mean for us, for anyone who stumbles into the forest? Helen met his gaze. It means the forest isn't just a place. It's alive, and it chooses who it lets in and who it keeps. The following morning, Helen and Ethan decided to return to Hollow Ridge one last time. They packed supplies, the journal, and the lockets, determined to uncover whatever final piece of the puzzle they had missed. The injured Bobcat stayed behind, resting under the watchful eye of Helen's assistant. The forest felt different this time. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. Helen couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was aware of their presence, watching their every move. Ethan stayed close, his gaze constantly scanning the trees. When they reached the clearing with the sentinel, the lead Bobcat was waiting for them. It emerged from the shadows, its golden eyes locking onto Helen. This time, it didn't growl or hesitate. Instead, it turned and began leading them toward the pedestal. The chamber was as they had left it, the carvings on the walls seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. Helen approached the pedestal and placed the lockets on it, her hands trembling slightly. The air around them grew warmer, almost electric, as though the forest itself was responding. Ethan stepped closer. "Do you feel that?" Helen nodded. It's alive." The carvings seemed to shift under the light, their lines becoming clearer. Helen realized they told more than just one story. They showed a cycle, people entering the forest, connecting with its creatures, and leaving behind something of themselves. The lockets were not just keepsakes. They were markers, symbols of those who had been chosen by the forest. Helen placed her hand on the pedestal, a strange calm washing over her. Margaret and Edward didn't disappear. They became part of this cycle. The forest needed them, just like it needed these Bobcats. Ethan looked at her, his expression torn between disbelief and awe. "And now it needs us?" Helen met his gaze, the weight of the forest story pressing down on her. Maybe it's not about need. Maybe it's about understanding, about making sure their story isn't forgotten. As they stood in the chamber, the lead Bobcat let out a low, resonant growl. The sound echoed through the space, a reminder that their journey wasn't over. Helen knew they had uncovered the truth, but the forest still held its secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Helen stood in the chamber, the faint hum of energy from the pedestal resonating through her body. The two lockets lay side by side, their significance now undeniable. The carvings surrounding the chamber glowed faintly, telling a story Helen could almost feel more than understand. The forest wasn't merely alive, it was ancient, its roots tangled with the lives of those who ventured too deeply into its embrace.
Ethan's voice broke the stillness. If Margaret and Edward became part of this, whatever this is, then what happens now? What does the forest want from us? Helen ran her fingers over the carvings, tracing the lines of the intertwined figures. Maybe it doesn't want anything. Maybe it's just showing us the truth.
The lead Bobcat, still watching from the edge of the chamber, let out a low growl. The sound wasn't menacing, it was purposeful. It padded forward, stopping just short of the pedestal. Its golden eyes locked on Helen's, and for a brief moment, she felt a surge of understanding, as though the animal were trying to communicate something. "I think it wants us to see more," she said softly, her gaze never leaving the Bobcats. Ethan frowned. "See what? We've already found the lockets, the carvings, the journal. What else is there?" Helen turned to him, her voice steady. "Answers. The forest hasn't told us everything yet." The Bobcat began moving again, heading toward another tunnel at the far side of the chamber. Helen hesitated for only a moment before following, her hand brushing against the lockets in her pocket for reassurance. Ethan sighed, but quickly fell in step behind her. The tunnel was narrow, the walls damp and cold. The air grew heavier the farther they went, and Helen's headlamp cast long, flickering shadows that danced across the stone. The lead bobcat moved with purpose, its movements fluid and silent. Behind them, faint growls echoed, signaling that the other bobcats were close. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into another cavern. This one was different from the others. It was vast, the ceiling soaring high above them. Pale light filtered in through cracks in the rock, illuminating a large pool at the center of the space. The water was perfectly still, its surface like glass, reflecting the soft light and the jagged stone walls.
"What is this place?"
Ethan asked, his voice echoing slightly. Helen stepped closer to the pool, her breath catching as she saw what lay beneath the surface. Bones scattered across the bottom, their pale forms illuminated by the dim light. But among the bones were objects, rusted watches, torn clothing, fragments of bags. They were remnants of people who had been here before, people who had become part of the forest story. "This is where it ends," Helen whispered, her voice heavy with awe, "for those who don't leave." Ethan crouched beside the pool, his eyes narrowing as he studied the objects.
"You think this is Margaret and Edward?"
Helen nodded.
"And others."
The carvings showed a cycle, people drawn to the forest, leaving behind their lives to become part of something bigger. Ethan stood, his jaw tightening. So, the forest lures people in, kills them? "I don't think it's that simple," Helen said, her gaze fixed on the water. "It's not about death. It's about connection, about becoming part of the forest in a way we can't fully understand." The lead bobcat padded to the edge of the pool, its golden eyes reflecting in the still water. It let out a low, mournful growl, a sound that resonated through the cavern like a lament. Helen crouched beside it, her hand resting on the lockets in her pocket. She pulled them out, holding them up so they caught the faint light. The bobcat's gaze flickered to the lockets, and for a moment, it seemed almost at peace.
"What do we do now?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
Helen turned to him, her expression calm but resolute. "We honor their story. We make sure it isn't forgotten." Ethan frowned.
"And how do we do that?"
Helen stood, holding the lockets tightly. "We take these back. We share what we've found. The forest didn't show us this just to keep it hidden." The cavern seemed to react to her words. The light grew softer, the air less oppressive. The bobcat let out one final growl before turning and disappearing into the shadows, its presence a silent acknowledgement of their mission. As Helen and Ethan made their way back through the tunnels, the weight of the lockets felt heavier, as though they carried more than just metal and memories. The forest had entrusted them with something sacred, a story that spanned generations, connecting lives in ways neither of them fully understood. When they emerged into the open air, the forest was still and quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. Helen glanced back at the entrance to the caverns, her heart heavy but resolute. "This isn't just about Margaret and Edward," she said softly. "It's about everyone who came before them, and everyone who will come after."
Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "Then we make sure their story lives on."
As they walked back toward the trailhead, Helen felt a strange sense of peace. The forest had revealed its secrets, and now it was up to her to ensure those secrets didn't fade into obscurity. Margaret and Edward's story wouldn't be forgotten, and neither would the forest's silent, watchful guardians. Back at the clinic, the injured bobcat was awake and pacing in its enclosure. Its golden eyes followed Helen and Ethan as they entered, carrying with them the weight of their journey. The two lockets sat on Helen's desk, glinting faintly under the fluorescent light. Helen knelt beside the cage, watching the bobcat move with renewed energy. Its recovery had been nothing short of remarkable, as though the forest had lent it strength to see its purpose fulfilled. "It's almost like it knew we'd come back," Ethan said, leaning against the counter, "like it's waiting for something." Helen nodded. "The bobcat has always been part of this. It's tied to Margaret and Edward, to the forest's story, but now it's time to let it go."
Ethan frowned. "You're releasing it? So soon?"
Helen stood, her gaze steady. "It doesn't belong here. It belongs to the forest. Whatever role it had to play in this, it's done." That afternoon, Helen and Ethan loaded the bobcat into a secure crate and drove back to Hollow Ridge. The forest was quiet, the air crisp and cold. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Helen opened the crate, stepping back as the bobcat cautiously emerged. It paused for a moment, its golden eyes locking on to Helen's. Then, with a powerful leap, it disappeared into the trees. Helen watched until it was gone, her chest heavy with a mix of sadness and relief. Ethan broke the silence.
"Do you think it'll go back to the others?"
Helen nodded. "It's where it belongs now." The two stood in silence for a moment, the forest around them still and watchful. Finally, Helen turned, her hand brushing against the lockets in her pocket. "We have one last thing to do." Over the next week, Helen and Ethan worked tirelessly to piece together the story. They pored over old records, compiled Margaret's journal, and studied the carvings from the cavern. They reached out to local historians, cryptic as they shared only what they could verify, carefully balancing the need to protect the forest's secrets with their desire to honor Margaret and Edward's memory. The result was a detailed account of the couple's journey, a story of love, adventure, and sacrifice. Helen wrote it all down, her words weaving together the pieces they had uncovered. The lockets became the centerpiece of the narrative, symbols of the bond between the couple and the forest that had claimed them. The story was shared cautiously at first, presented to local historical societies and nature preservation groups. It resonated deeply, sparking curiosity and reverence for the mysterious forest. Visitors began arriving not to conquer the wild, but to respect it, leaving offerings at the edge of Hollow Ridge and treating the forest with a quiet awe. But Helen and Ethan were careful to keep the deeper truths hidden. The carvings, the pool of bones, and the ancient cycle of connection between humans and the forest remained their secret. It wasn't a story meant for the world. It was something sacred, meant only for those who could truly understand. One evening, after a particularly long day at the clinic, Helen and Ethan sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, and the stars began to peek through the fading light. "You think we did the right thing?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet. Helen glanced at him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "I think we honored their memory, and we've given people a reason to see the forest differently." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. "What about the forest itself? Do you think it's satisfied?" Helen smiled faintly. "I don't think it's about satisfying the forest. It's about respecting it, understanding that we're just a small part of something much bigger." They fell into a comfortable silence, the sounds of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. For the first time in weeks, Helen felt a sense of peace. The story they had uncovered wasn't just about Margaret and Edward. It was about the unbreakable bond between life and the wild, a connection that transcended time and understanding. As the stars filled the sky, Helen reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the lockets. She held them up, the faint starlight reflecting off their surfaces. In that moment, she felt their weight lessen, as though Margaret and Edward's presence had finally found peace. Ethan glanced at her. "What will you do with them?" Helen smiled softly. "I'll keep them safe. They're part of the forest's story, and now they're part of mine." The night stretched on, the forest whispering its eternal secrets. And though Helen and Ethan knew their journey with the forest was over, the bond it had created would stay with them forever. They had become part of the cycle, witnesses to a story that would continue long after they were gone. A story of connection, resilience, and the quiet power of the wild.